What is up, guys? Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about margins and padding. So what we have is a paragraph in the center of the page. And the reason why it's in the center of the page is it's been given some styling, which we're going to come back to a bit later. We can also see that the paragraph has a 1 pixel black solid border surrounding it. Now, what is the problem with this border? It looks like it's too close to the text. In fact, it appears the text is actually touching the border in some places. It gives the text a very cramped feel to it. And we can fix that by using the padding property on the paragraph. Now we're just going to use padding, which is a shorthand property, and we're going to give it the value 5 pixels. Take a look at the paragraph inside the border. Watch what happens. Notice we now have 5 pixels of space between the edge of the paragraph and the border itself. And we can control this by using different values. So we could change it to 10 pixels. It really depends on how much padding or extra space we want. Try 25 pixels. It should also hopefully go without saying that since this takes a sizing value, we can use any of the available sizings in CSS. For example, if I wanted to, I could specify using EM. I could say padding 2EM, for example. We could even specify using percentages. For example, we could say padding 10%. Let's take a look at that effect. The next thing I'd like to do is to introduce you to the dev tools. We haven't really used this so far. In Firefox on Windows, we can use Control-Shift-and-I to fire up the dev tools. Or if perhaps you are on a Mac, you can use Command-Option-and-I. Another thing we can do is just right-click on an element that we're interested in and choose Inspect. And it's automatically going to open the DevTools and it's going to show us the part of the HTML we're interested in. Notice as well, as I hover my cursor over a certain part of the HTML, it's automatically highlighted on the HTML page. Now, if we select our paragraph, let's head down to this layout option and we can see a visualization of what's happening here. So we have our center element, that's the paragraph itself. And notice outside the space of that paragraph, we have our padding. So that's the space between the paragraph itself and the actual border. So there's the padding highlighted on the screen right now. Then we have the border itself. And outside of the border, we have what is referred to as margin. Now we come back to the reason why this paragraph is where it is. It's in the center of the page at the moment. Let's reduce the padding slightly, and let's set the element back to its default position. The reason why it is where it is right now is to do with the margin property. But if there was no margin property in place, this is the natural location of where the element is going to appear, which is at the top left of the page. So keeping in mind that margin refers to the space outside of the border, we could provide a property such as margin left, and then input a value in pixels. So watch what happens if we provide a value of 100 pixels for the margin left property. The paragraph moves to the right by 100 pixels. In fact, if we were to open that in the dev tools by choosing Inspect, heading to the layout section, we can now highlight the margin on the left. You can see here it says that the margin on the left is 100 pixels. We still have our 10 pixels of padding inside the element, but outside the element, we have 100 pixel margin on the left. Now notice as well that we have by default some margin at the top and bottom. We have 16 pixels at the top, 16 at the bottom, but over on the right-hand side, we don't have any margin so far. So if we wanted to push that element down further, we could actually modify the value of margin top. So you know it's at 16 pixels at the moment. What if we were to set that to 100 pixels as well? Well, the element's going to jump downwards by 100 pixels. Now, these are absolute values at the moment, which again means depending on the viewport, it could be problematic because potentially this could actually push the paragraph off the bottom of someone's viewport if they didn't have a very tall viewport, for example. So in some cases, it might make sense to use percentage value here for our margins, because that way, as the viewport scales, the margin is going to be a percentage of that viewport. So let's set our margin left to 25%. And let's set our margin top to 25%. So now we can see our paragraph element is reasonably towards the center of the current viewport. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. We can also use a shorthand property for margin. For example, we could just specify margin. We could say 25%, and nothing's going to change regarding our element. So when we just have one value for margin, it's specifying top, right, left, and bottom margin values. If we specify two values, well, let's see what happens. So we can see that the left margin is only 5%, whereas the top and bottom margins are 25%. So if we provide two values, then the first value applies to top and bottom, and the second value applies to left and right. We can take this a bit further. We can even provide three values. What will happen here is that the first value will apply to the top margin, second value will apply to the right and left margins, and third value will apply to the bottom margin. If we decide to pass four values, then it will apply to the margins in clockwise order, starting with the top. So we'll have margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left. And if you're wondering, it's similar with the padding. So we've just looked at the overall shorthand for padding and provided a single value in pixels, which then applies to the top padding, the right padding, the bottom padding, and the left padding. But we could be more specific. For example, we could set padding left and set that to 50%, for example. So what we'll see now is a lot of padding on the left, but no padding on the top and right. Naturally, that element doesn't look very good at the moment. Let's set it to something a bit more readable. Let's try 10% for padding left. Then we could also specify some of the other padding locations specifically. So we could say padding top, 5%, for example, padding bottom, 5%, and padding right, 10%. So what we have here is an element where there's slightly more padding at the left and right, but slightly less padding at the top and bottom. Just to see that effect in a slightly more extreme way, let's reduce the top and bottom padding. Now we can see the space at the top and the bottom of the element has been reduced. But this is making use of the long-handed version of things. So we could just use padding. Firstly, we can define the top and bottom, which is 2% in this case. Then we can specify the left and right, which is 10%. So this single CSS rule replaces all four of these CSS rules. That's why it's referred to as shorthanded. Let's refresh the page. We see no change because this rule is equivalent to the four rules that we've just deleted. Now let's delete the margin rules on the paragraphs because there are a couple of extra values which are very useful for using margins. The first is to set the value to auto. So notice what happens when we do this. Margin, auto. Now the element appears directly in the center. So what margin auto is doing is it's setting the left margin being exactly equal to the right margin. So the element appears in the center. Now we can also do stuff like margin left auto. Note what happens here. It makes the left margin as large as possible while still keeping the element in the viewport. And if we specify margin right auto, it does the opposite. Although this is how the element's going to appear by default anyway. So margin left could be a lot more useful if we wanted the element to start from the right-hand side of the page. Now let's just address one CSS headache. This causes every CSS developer a problem at some point. It's almost a rite of passage. And that is, what if we set margin top to auto? Theoretically, we might imagine that should push the element to the bottom of the page. It doesn't do that, unfortunately. In order for margin top to work, we need to change the display property of the parent. So what we've done here is we've wrapped our paragraph inside div. So this is going to be our parent element, and paragraph is obviously our child element here. So let's style up that div. Now we'll talk about the display property a little bit later. For now, let's just give you the solution to this problem. We set the div to a display of flex. And just so we can see the div, let's set the background color to gray. And you can see at the moment, it's only taking up the height of the child. So let's change the height of that div to 100 VH. So it should now take up the whole space in the viewport. Notice straight away that that element has jumped to the bottom. So that margin top auto has kicked into place. So now we could also specify margin bottom auto, and it's going to center the element vertically. In fact, if we just use margin auto, once we have display flex, let's try that again, margin auto, we can see it's both horizontally and vertically centered. If you didn't know to change the display property to flex, it's very, very difficult to get an element vertically centered. Now, there are things that we can do. For example, if we remove that display of flex, you'll notice that straight away the element heads towards the top of the page. We could guess at a percentage. It's often going to be somewhere around 25%, but it does depend on the size of the element. So let's set margin top to 25% on the paragraph. And let's just get rid of that div for now. We don't need that at the moment. And you can see that's more or less in the center. You can also set margin left to auto and margin right to auto. All right, so key takeaways from this lesson: how to set the padding on an element, how to set the margins on an element, the differences between padding and margins. So padding is inside the border, margins are outside the border, and also how to make use of the auto value for the various margin properties. Thanks very much for watching. Catch you in the next part of the course.